Today's quiet journey drifts toward the islands of Japan, a place where mountains rise in gentle layers and forests hold a silence older than memory. It is a landscape shaped by mist and shifting light, where early stories formed slowly from the rhythms of wind, water, and earth. This narrative will settle into that world with unhurried steps, exploring how mythology emerged, how it shaped lives across centuries, and how it lingered in the corners of daily rituals and ancient ceremonies. The story begins softly, moving through the land where myths were born, traveling from the earliest whispers of creation to the subtle symbols that shaped an enduring cultural world. Long before written memory settled into paper and ink, the islands that would become Japan moved through cycles of mist, rainfall, sunlight, and shifting seasons. Mountains rose in gentle rolling layers along the horizon, their peaks wrapped in drifting clouds that changed shape with the passing hours. Rivers carved narrow channels through valleys where reeds swayed in the wind, and forests grew deep and heavy with cedar, pine, and moss. In these early centuries, the landscape carried a quietness that shaped the mood of the people who lived among it. Villages stood near water and forest edges, their simple structures formed from materials taken directly from the land: wood for posts, bundles of straw for roofs, and packed soil for thresholds warmed by countless footsteps. Life unfolded at a measured pace, guided by the movement of the sun and marked by the arrival of each season. Summers brought humid heat that clung to the skin and softened the edges of mountains in shimmering air. Winters arrived with crisp clarity, the sound of wind filtering through bare branches. Spring revealed the pale blossoms of wild cherry trees, and autumn carried the scent of smoke from hearth fires and fallen leaves turning gradually to mulch. In this environment, the boundary between the natural and the mysterious felt permeable. A mountain ridge veiled in fog could inspire wonder. A sudden gust of wind rattling bamboo could evoke curiosity about unseen presences. Pools of still water reflected the sky in ways that stirred quiet speculation. These impressions became the earliest outlines of stories, fragments that travelers carried between villages, that elders whispered during long winter nights, and that ritual practitioners shaped into chants and seasonal rites. When the first written chronicles appeared many centuries later, they preserved myths that had drifted through generations of memory. These texts described a world formed not through abrupt divine gestures, but through gradual shaping, where deities embodied natural elements and where the creation of islands mirrored the slow emergence of land from shifting seas. The tone of these stories matched the land from which they grew, unhurried, spacious, and attentive to detail rather than confrontation. This narrative will follow that early world, beginning with the origins of myth itself, how landscapes, rituals, and shifting perceptions gave rise to a mythological tradition that shaped the heart of Japanese culture. It will move gently from the birth of these legends into the figures who defined them, the mysteries preserved in archaeological remnants, the quiet lives of elites who formalized rituals, and the broader patterns that connected people to unseen forces. The pace will remain steady, the atmosphere tranquil, and the tone softened by distance, reflecting a world where mythology formed slowly, like the deepening color of dusk across a field. In the earliest ages of the Japanese archipelago, mythology did not begin as a single story, nor as the product of a sudden moment. It began instead as a gradual collection of impressions shaped by the land itself. The world people inhabited was filled with quiet forces. Rivers that carved paths through stone, mountains crowned with drifting clouds, forests where light filtered in shifting patterns, and seas that rose and fell with a rhythm older than memory. These forces created an environment that encouraged contemplation, watching, and careful listening. Myth in this world emerged like mist from the earth, shaped not by one storyteller, but by generations of observation. Communities lived in small clusters, often along the edges of forests or near flowing water. Each settlement experienced nature with intimacy. A sudden storm rolling across the sea, a landslide on a mountain slope, or the unexpected blooming of a plant out of season became occurrences that asked for explanation. People noticed how certain trees grew with unusual twist or height, or how stones seemed to bear markings shaped by wind and water. In time, these natural features became places of quiet reverence, and the presence felt in these spots grew into the earliest conceptions of kami, beings understood not as distant gods, but as presences woven into the land. As families gathered near hearth fires, stories formed in unhurried fragments. Some tales described the origin of a particular stream, its waters believed to be stirred into being by an unseen hand. Others explained the contour of a mountain ridge or the presence of a solitary tree that stood against the wind. These stories were shared softly, often during times when work slowed and reflection deepened, after harvest, during cold rains, or in the muted hours before dawn fully broke. Each retelling added small changes, shaping myths that carried subtle variations from one village to another. Certain individuals held knowledge of rituals, seasonal observances, and ceremonial gestures. These early ritualists were not separate from their communities but were shaped by them. They gathered natural objects, branches from evergreen trees, stones from riverbeds, and arranged them in ways that marked thresholds, boundaries, or transitions. Offerings of rice, cloth, or water were placed near certain locations, not as grand acts, but as gestures of respect toward forces that could not be fully understood. These practices became the foundation of Shinto, a tradition that remained closely tied to the rhythm of the landscape. When communities combined through marriage, migration, or alliance, their stories blended. Myths that explained the origins of one river valley merged with tales from another. Creation stories grew more elaborate as they incorporated elements of new landscapes, linking islands into a unified narrative. Over time, some tales gained prominence, stories of deities who shaped the islands, who embodied the sun, the moon, or the storms. These deities did not emerge abruptly. They accumulated significance as communities recognized shared patterns in the world around them. As centuries passed, the need to preserve these myths more formally grew. Leaders sought a lineage that connected them to the divine, while ritual specialists sought to safeguard traditions that risked being forgotten. When writing systems were introduced, myths long shaped by oral memory found a new form. The Kojiki and Nihon Shoki emerged from this era of preservation. Texts that gathered centuries of shifting stories, fragmentary chants, and ritual recollections into coherent narratives. Yet, even in written form, the myths retained their early character. They reflected a world shaped not by conflict but by continuity, not by sudden miracles, but by the slow shaping of earth, sea, and sky. Behind every myth lay an echo of daily encounters with nature. The creation of the islands echoed volcanic formations and tectonic rumblings. The withdrawal of the sun goddess mirrored periods of harsh seasonal change. The stormy temperament of certain deities reflected natural patterns of wind and sea. These connections remained subtle but present, grounding mythology in the land that nurtured it. Japanese myths began not as distant fantasies, but as reflections, quiet, cumulative understandings of a world observed with patience. They grew as slowly as cedar trees and became rooted in the culture as deeply as the moss that covered ancient stones. Through these early centuries, the myths took shape like the soft erosion of earth by rivers, continuous, gentle, and enduring. In the long arc of early Japanese myth, few figures occupy a presence as steady and pervasive as Amaterasu, the deity associated with the sun and the gentle illumination that shapes the world. Her story does not unfold in bursts of sudden energy, nor does it hinge upon great battles or urgent transformations. Instead, it develops gradually, the way dawn develops from the faintest pale outline to a full wash of daylight. She emerges not as a force of spectacle, but as a symbol of continuity, order, and the sustaining rhythm that binds nature to the unfolding of time. In the earliest layers of myth preserved in oral tradition, Amaterasu appeared as a quiet principle of harmony. Her presence mirrored the dependable rise of the sun across mountains, a daily event observed with reverence long before her story was recorded. Fields came to life beneath her light, and forests revealed their shifting shapes and varied textures in the soft glow that filtered through their branches. The still surfaces of rice paddies reflected her passage, turning muted colors into pale gold during early mornings. These natural phenomena shaped her early identity, long before she became the central figure of imperial mythology. According to the classical compilations, she was born from a ritual gesture of purification. Her father, Izanagi, knew from an encounter with the shadows of the underworld, performed a cleansing that separated light from darkness. As he rinsed his left eye, she emerged as a luminous being whose radiance needed no declaration. Her appearance was described in terms of clarity rather than brilliance, an unfurling warmth that spread without force, like sunlight easing its way across a hillside after a long night. She was given responsibility over the plane of high heaven, a realm envisioned as broad, calm, and orderly. In these early texts, the realm is not depicted with architectural splendor or divine opulence, but rather with a restrained serenity, the kind found in wide-open spaces, untouched by chaos. Amaterasu's stewardship of this realm emphasized maintenance rather than mastery, ensuring that harmony prevailed among the myriad presences that inhabited it. Her authority was expressed not through thunderous commands, but through quiet constancy. Among the preserved myths, one moment stands out for its stillness disguised as disruption, the period in which Amaterasu withdrew from the world and hid within a cave. This retreat was not framed as an act of vengeance or rage, but rather a gesture of wounded withdrawal, born from discord created by her sibling Susanoo. The story carries with it the muted sense of imbalance seen in nature when sunlight recedes unexpectedly, when storms gather, seasons falter, or daylight shifts into unseasonal dimness. Her absence cast the world into subdued tones, the heavens dimmed, and the land below fell into a muted quiet that was described not with alarm, but with heavy stillness. With the sun hidden, Shadows elongated across fields and forests, and the boundaries between day and night blurred. This myth held a reflection of lived experience, long winters when the sun appeared weakened, or storms when clouds shrouded the sky for days, imprinting a sense of suspended time upon early communities. The tale resonated because it represented something familiar, a moment of collective hesitation while awaiting nature's return to balance. The other deities gathered in careful deliberation as the absence of light continued. Their assembly was described as measured, their steps deliberate, their concerns expressed with low voices. Meetings took place near the cave's entrance, where they observed the sealed stone that shielded her from the world. The mood was not fearful, but contemplative, as though each deity considered the deep meaning of light's withdrawal and the necessity of coaxing it back gently. They arranged offerings with meticulous attention, jewels strung into patterns, cloth dyed in soft, earthy colors, and a mirror polished until it reflected even the faintest ambient light. Evergreen branches, symbols of endurance through seasons, were placed near the cave's threshold. The gathered deities did not attempt force. They used presence, patience, and gesture. Rituals were performed in calm succession, a dance whose movements created a rhythm that stirred the air, a moment of laughter that carried lightly over the land, and the shining of the mirror positioned to invite curiosity. The mirror, smooth and flawless, reflected the world outside the cave with such clarity that the returning light became drawn toward it. When Amaterasu looked upon the mirror, the cave's darkness shifted. She saw a brightness echoed back at her, not as a challenge, but as a reminder of the world she illuminated. Her descent from the shadowed interior was gradual, and when the stone at the cave's entrance moved aside, light spilled outward slowly, widening across the land like the spread of dawn. It is said that as she emerged, the world regained its familiar colors, and the air filled once more with the gentle energy of sunlight drifting across water and wood. This moment became one of the foundational episodes of Japanese myth, later reflected in seasonal festivals that celebrated renewal after winter and the soft return of vitality after periods of stillness. For communities whose survival depended on agricultural cycles, this myth resonated deeply. It spoke to the knowledge that light could wane but would always return. It offered, in story form, reassurance that cycles of hardship eventually yielded to cycles of warmth. Over time, Amaterasu's narrative came to anchor the legitimacy of early rulers. The imperial family traced its lineage to her, establishing a connection between earthly governance and celestial order. This connection was expressed not through grand displays, but through rituals steeped in calm repetition. At dawn, offerings of rice, salt, and water were placed upon altars as the first rays of sunlight crossed the horizon. Priests tended these ceremonies with quiet precision, their movements deliberate, their garments rustling softly against the smooth floors of shrines. The most sacred of these locations, Aizgran Shrine, became a locus of devotion. Nestled among ancient forests where sunlight filtered through tall cedar trees, the shrine exuded an atmosphere of profound stillness. Each beam of its architecture, each stone of its pathways, was arranged with respect for natural forms and the subtle interplay of shadow and light. The shrine was periodically rebuilt in a ritual cycle known as Shikinen Sengu, a practice reflecting the belief that renewal, even of sacred structures, was essential to harmony. The rebuilding underscored impermanence as a form of reverence, demonstrating that continuity was maintained through reconstruction rather than preservation alone. Amaterasu's presence extended beyond the shrine and into the symbolic language of daily life. Mirrors placed in household altars echoed the original offering that coaxed her from the cave. White cloth, associated with purity and serenity, evoked the brightness linked to her influence. The rising sun became a motif for beginnings, quietly reflected in art, poetry, and the arrangement of objects within homes. Her myth, as it evolved, provided a gentle structure for understanding the passage of time, the return of growth after desolation, and the cycles that guided life across centuries. As generations passed, the story of Amaterasu remained steady, its shape little altered by the changing world. Unlike myths marked by conflict and upheaval, her narrative maintained a tone of stillness, reflection, and equilibrium. It continued to evoke the faint glow of early morning light spreading across rice paddies, the warmth of midday sun settling on the backs of those tending fields, and the golden hues cast upon mountains as dusk approached. Through these impressions, her story endured as a quiet centerpiece of Japanese mythology, a tale not of spectacle but of rhythm, not of dominance but of presence. It reflected the world from which it emerged, a world shaped by subtle changes, patient observation, and the enduring relationship between humanity and the natural forces that sustained it. As the centuries passed, the narrative surrounding Amaterasu deepened, shaped not by dramatic retellings, but by the slow layering of ritual practice and collective memory. Her influence grew like sediment accumulating on a riverbed, imperceptible at first glance, yet substantial when viewed across the long sweep of time. Communities that once understood her presence as an explanation for the rising sun gradually came to see her as an anchor for social order, seasonal routines, and the delicate balance between humanity and nature. Her lineage became central to these understandings. The myths described her children and their descendants not in rapid succession, but in careful, measured descriptions that emphasized continuity over conflict. Among these descendants was the deity Amino Oshihomimi, whose quiet contemplation of the world below shaped the next stage of divine descent. He gazed upon the earth with a sense of measured observation, noting the varied terrains, the sprawling mountains, the clusters of human dwellings, and the subtle interplay of shadow and light moving across the land. When he hesitated to descend, Amaterasu sent another emissary, Ninigi no Mikoto, a figure who carried symbols meant to represent authority not as force, but as guidance. The descent of Ninigi no Mikoto became one of the central myths that linked the realm of the kami with the human world. His journey was depicted not as a triumphant arrival, but as a gentle transition, marked by the soft descent of a celestial being into a landscape defined by quiet valleys and distant coastlines. He carried with him 3 sacred treasures: a mirror representing clarity and self-reflection, a jewel symbolizing harmony and connection, and a sword representing resolve. These objects were not described with exaggerated grandeur. They appeared in the texts as symbols that carried subtle layers of meaning. The mirror was said to echo the same polished surface that had drawn Amaterasu from her cave. Its presence in rituals connected participants to the idea of illumination, of seeing oneself clearly, of recognizing harmony in the surrounding world. The jewel, with its smooth surface and deep color, symbolized continuity and cohesion, an unbroken link between generations. The sword, although associated with strength, was described in ways that emphasized its ceremonial value rather than its use in conflict. It was a reminder that strength could be still, steadfast, and quietly protective. In the quiet valleys where Ninigi no Mikoto settled, myths intertwined with early agricultural practices. The deity's descent coincided with the cultivation of rice, a crop that required patience, cooperation, and an understanding of seasonal rhythms. Early farmers often looked to the sky for signs that echoed mythical events, observing the angle of sunlight, the behavior of clouds, and the shifting winds that signaled the arrival of rains. In this way, Amaterasu's lineage became intertwined with the sustenance of daily life, providing a framework through which communities understood their relationship to the land. Generations later, the figure of Emperor Jimmu emerged in the mythological lineage. He was described not with heroic flourish, but with calm dignity, as someone who carried the legacy of Amaterasu through careful leadership. His journey eastward, a foundational myth in the Nihon Shoki, unfolded across mountain passes, river crossings, and quiet fields. The landscapes he traversed shaped the tone of the narrative. Each obstacle was framed not as an adversary to be conquered, but as a natural barrier that required patience and deliberation. When Jimmu eventually established his rule, it was depicted as the settling of a long process rather than the climax of a dramatic arc. This lineage solidified the role of Amaterasu as the symbolic ancestor of Japan's imperial line. Over time, her presence became woven into the ceremonies performed at court, where actions were governed by specific sequences, measured movements, and periods of silence that allowed participants to reflect on their connection to the past. Textiles worn during rituals bore patterns inspired by sunlight, rays extending outward in symmetrical lines, or motifs representing the slow transition from night to morning. The architecture of important court buildings reflected the same sensibilities, with open spaces designed to capture the soft glow of dawn or the filtered radiance of midday. In rural areas far from the imperial center, her influence remained equally strong, though expressed in different ways. Shrines dedicated to her stood in fields where rice grew in reflective pools, their wooden beams weathered by years of sunlight and rain. Offerings left at these shrines were simple: bowls of rice, cups of water, or strips of cloth tied to sacred ropes. The rituals performed there were often quiet and solitary, involving slow movements, the careful placement of objects, and the deep stillness of contemplation. In these settings, Amaterasu was less a symbol of political authority and more a presence that affirmed the natural rhythms of life. Seasonal festivals further preserved her story. During times when the days lengthened, communities celebrated the strengthening of her light. Lanterns were lit in long rows, their flickering flames forming gentle rivers of illumination along pathways and across shrine grounds. The warm glow of these lanterns mirrored the return of sunlight after winter, creating an atmosphere of both celebration and calm. During harvest festivals, rice stalks were arranged in offerings, their golden grains reflecting the subtle radiance associated with her presence. These events were not characterized by loud displays, but by measured dances, steady drum beats, and the murmured recitation of poems that spoke of sunlight filtering through leaves. As myths were retold across generations, Amaterasu's story shifted slightly in emphasis. Later periods depicted her with qualities aligned with order and propriety, reflecting the values of the eras that retold her narrative. Yet the core of her story remained tied to light, to renewal, and to the return of warmth after periods of absence. Her myth continued to offer reassurance during difficult seasons, times of poor harvest, prolonged rain, or illness spreading quietly through communities. Her return from the cave symbolized the return of stability, the reawakening of the world after disruption. During the rise of syncretic traditions in later centuries, where Shinto and Buddhism intertwined, Amaterasu maintained her presence with a quiet resilience. Temples and shrines that once stood apart began to share spaces, and rituals blended into new forms. Yet her role remained constant, a guiding light in times of uncertainty, a reminder of the world's natural cycles, a symbol of the luminous qualities that could not be entirely extinguished even in the darkest circumstances. In art, she appeared not as a powerful figure dominating the scene, but as a centered presence surrounded by soft radiance. Scrolls depicted her with lines that suggested warmth rather than intensity. Her surroundings were often serene, a landscape of gently rising hills or a cloud motif drawn with slender brushstrokes. These images reinforced the calming energy associated with her mythology, transforming her into a symbol not of commanding force, but of enduring stability. The essence of Amaterasu's story across centuries remained constant, an embodiment of equilibrium, an assurance that illumination would follow obscurity, and a reminder that nature's patterns continued even when they seemed to falter. Through her myth, early Japan found a narrative that mirrored its own landscape, one defined by subtle shifts rather than abrupt changes, by renewal rather than conquest, by a quiet resilience that endured across time. In this way, the story of Amaterasu stands not only as a cornerstone of mythology, but as a reflection of Japan's earliest worldview, an understanding shaped by observation, reverence, and the profound calm that arises from recognizing one's place within a much larger rhythm. As the story of Amaterasu settled into the cultural memory of early Japan, her presence continued to influence the shape of rituals, the construction of shrines, and the subtle gestures that guided everyday reverence. Her light lingered in poetry, in seasonal observances, in the measured rebuilding of sacred spaces, and in the quiet way communities acknowledged the shifting patterns of nature. Yet, behind the fully formed myths that entered chronicles and ceremonies lay an even older layer of meaning. Echoes of beliefs that existed long before the imperial line took shape, fragments of ritual practice carried across centuries, and objects buried in the earth long before stories were written. These earlier traces formed a deeper landscape beneath the mythology, a tapestry woven from artifacts, forgotten shrines, and silent spaces that preserved remnants of belief older than the tales themselves. With time, archaeologists and historians uncovered these fragments, offering glimpses into worlds where myth was not yet narrative, but a diffuse presence felt in stone, clay, water, and soil. Moving from the luminous figure of Amaterasu into this quieter archaeological realm reveals how mythology emerged not only from stories, but from material expressions, objects shaped by hands that understood the land as a living partner. And so, the narrative shifts gently from the world of celestial lineage to the earthbound record of ancient ritual, drifting into the mysteries preserved beneath layers of sediment, moss, and memory. Long before mythology was shaped into cohesive tales, Belief expressed itself through objects, landscapes, and arrangements that endured far beyond the communities that crafted them. These remnants, revealed only after centuries of burial, formed a silent dialogue between past and present. Unlike the structured narratives of later eras, these artifacts offered impressions rather than explanations, shadows of ideas preserved in clay, stone, and wood. They spoke in textures and patterns, carrying meanings that shifted subtly with each new discovery. Among the earliest and most enigmatic of these artifacts were the dog figures of the Jomon period. Their surfaces, marked with intricate impressions of cord and carved lines, reflected a level of artistry developed through generations of careful hands. Some figures possessed expansive, exaggerated eyes. Others bore patterns resembling armor or garments whose purpose had long been forgotten. The clay held the faint memory of warmth from ancient hearths, and the broken limbs found in many excavations suggested rituals involving separation or transformation. These breaks appeared intentional, perhaps symbolizing transitions, offerings, or the dissolution of spiritual burdens. Though their purpose could not be articulated with certainty, their presence conveyed the seriousness with which early communities approached unseen forces. Equally mysterious were the Magatama, whose curved forms maintained cultural relevance for thousands of years. Their smooth contours reflected a reverence for natural materials, jade polished until it glowed faintly, agate carved into a shape that hinted at movement. These beads appeared not only in burial sites, but also in caches near rivers, mountaintops, and pathways leading toward ancient settlements. Their presence suggested protection, prestige, and ceremonial meaning. The Magatama's distinctive shape persisted, eventually becoming one of the 3 sacred treasures associated with imperial mythology. Its survival from prehistoric ritual object to national symbol revealed an unbroken thread of cultural continuity. Large burial mounds of the Kofun period added another dimension to the archaeological record. Their massive earthen forms, some stretching hundreds of meters, rose from the landscape with quiet authority. From above, many resembled keyholes, rounded fronts leading into squared back sections, connected in a design understood only through aerial view. Within these mounds, stone chambers held bronze mirrors, clay vessels, iron tools, and haniwa figures arranged in patterns that suggested careful planning. The bronze mirrors, often highly polished, hinted at rituals involving light and reflection, echoing the symbolic role mirrors later played in the myth of Amaterasu. Their presence in burial chambers signified the importance of clarity, revelation, and illumination, even in death. The haniwa placed atop these mounds created silent guardianship over the dead. Their hollow interiors and understated features conveyed a sense of watchfulness rather than aggression. Some haniwa depicted warriors, though not in dynamic poses. Others portrayed farmers, animals, or simple cylindrical forms. Their variety revealed a world where life was depicted in its full spectrum, peaceful, grounded, and stable. Positioned in rings around the mound, they formed a barrier between the world of the living and that of the deceased, serving as intermediaries who needed no movement or speech to fulfill their purpose. Beyond these monumental structures, numerous ancient shrines existed in forms far simpler than those known today. Many early shrines consisted of a single sacred object or natural feature, a rock formation shaped by centuries of wind and rain, a waterfall whose mist persisted even in winter, or a towering tree whose age signified endurance. These natural spaces became sites of reverence long before architectural shrines emerged. Archaeological excavations around such locations revealed minimal construction, perhaps a few wooden posts marking boundaries or stones arranged in deliberate rings. Offerings found nearby included charred remnants of rice, fragments of pottery, and tools left behind in ceremonies that emphasized humility and connection rather than grandeur. In remote forests, stone circles appeared in patterns that suggested astronomical or seasonal significance. Some faced solstices, others aligned with mountain ridges or the paths of rivers. Over centuries, moss softened their edges and tree roots intertwined with their bases, blurring the line between natural growth and ancient human intention. When archaeologists uncovered these circles, they found no inscriptions to explain them, only the quiet arrangement of stones weathered by countless seasons. Their silence invited contemplation rather than interpretation, allowing each researcher to sense the atmosphere of ancient gatherings performed beneath open skies. Lakeside archaeological sites offered another window into forgotten practices. Wooden stakes preserved in dark sediment suggested platforms or walkways used for water rituals. Pots found in lake beds held traces of grains, herbs, or minerals, indicating offerings made from boats or along shorelines. The calm surface of water, capable of reflecting light or concealing depths, resonated with the symbolic significance of transition, purity, and reflection. Modern examinations of pollen, seeds, and residue from these containers painted a picture of seasonal ceremonies performed with steady rhythms rather than dramatic gestures. Hidden shrines, often discovered by chance along mountain paths, preserved another layer of cultural continuity. Some shrines were little more than small wooden shelters containing a single stone or mirror. Others held wooden tablets inscribed with names of long-forgotten kami, or collections of folded paper tied to branches. Their location suggested they served as quiet markers for travelers, farmers, or hunters who paused briefly to acknowledge the presence of the unseen. These shrines did not demand attention. They blended seamlessly into the environment, their weathered materials absorbing the scents and sounds of the forest. Even when official Shinto shrines evolved into grand structures, their design retained the memory of earlier practices. Raised floors protected the interior from moisture. Unpainted wood allowed buildings to weather naturally, and the use of thatch roofs carried the scent of grass and earth into sacred spaces. The practice of shikinen sengu, which rebuilt the East Grand Shrine every 20 years, embodied an ancient belief in renewal through impermanence. Each reconstruction preserved not the physical materials, but the pattern, proportions, and spirit of the structure, echoing the idea that continuity is achieved through repetition rather than permanence. Archaeology also revealed direct evidence of early rituals tied to agriculture. Stone-lined pits near rice fields contained remnants of offerings made during planting seasons, grains arranged in simple patterns, fragments of woven cloth, and wooden tools placed with their handles carefully aligned. These offerings highlighted a worldview in which success in farming required cooperation with natural forces. Myths involving rice deities, seasonal cycles, and agricultural renewal echoed the real concerns of ancient communities who relied upon predictable weather and fertile land. In many ways, the archaeological record served as a quiet companion to the mythological one. Where myths offered narrative, archaeology offered atmosphere. Where myths provided characters, archaeology provided textures. Together, they formed an interwoven account of how early Japan understood the world, not through grand statements, but through countless small gestures that accumulated meaning across centuries. As each artifact emerged from soil or water, it carried with it the weight of time, the faint imprint of fingers pressing clay, the smoothness of stone polished long ago, the subtle curve of wood shaped with tools whose blades had long rusted away. These discoveries did not demand urgency. They invited stillness, observation, and appreciation of the slow unfolding of belief. Through these remnants, the mysteries of early Japanese culture lingered gently in the present, quiet, understated, and persistent, like the soft echo of footsteps on old forest paths or the distant sound of water moving beneath reeds. As the quiet artifacts of early Japan rested beneath layers of soil, revealing fragments of a world shaped by ritual, another layer of history unfolded above them, a world defined not by clay figurines or earthen mounds, but by carefully crafted gestures, refined language, and the quiet authority of the court. The transition from prehistoric ritual to aristocratic order did not erase the old beliefs. Instead, it allowed them to flow gently into a new setting. In time, the intangible atmosphere of ancient myth found its place among polished floors, silken garments, and incense drifting through wooden hallways. The calm reverence once offered to stones, rivers, and trees now became integrated into seasonal ceremonies, courtly observances, and the subdued rituals that shaped governance. Myth, once expressed through simple altars of earth and wood, became woven into the daily routines of those who moved through the serene spaces of the imperial palace. And so, the story shifts into the world of the Haian elite, where elegance, stillness, and ritualized calm shaped every aspect of existence, forming a quiet contrast with the earthbound world explored before. The Heian period unfolded with a sense of refined tranquility, shaped by the deliberate pace of an aristocracy that viewed daily life as an art form. Court nobles lived within an environment designed to emphasize elegance over urgency, subtle expression over direct action, and harmony over conflict. Their world, centered in the capital of Haian, brought together architecture, poetry, seasonal observances, and religious ceremony into a single unified atmosphere. Every movement, whether opening a screen door, arranging flowers, or arranging layers of silk, carried the weight of centuries of tradition. The palace complex itself embodied this measured existence. Buildings were crafted from smooth wood polished to a soft sheen that caught the muted light of early morning. Open verandas looked out onto carefully tended gardens, where ponds reflected the shifting sky and gravel paths curved gently between stands of bamboo and old pines. Water channels guided streams through the grounds with deliberate calm, allowing the sound of flowing water to echo softly beneath the eaves. This environment encouraged contemplation, discouraging abrupt motions or loud voices. Every detail expressed a worldview in which beauty emerged not from ornamentation, but from restraint. Rooms were spacious and uncluttered, divided by sliding screens painted with scenes of mountains, forests, or seasonal flowers. Light filtered through these screens with a muted softness, creating a diffused glow that shifted gently throughout the day. Tatami mats lined the floors, their woven textures giving a quiet resilience to each footstep. In the evenings, lamps filled with fragrant oil, created a warm, steady radiance that mingled with the faint scent of incense, settling over the palace like a fine mist. Clothing worn by the nobility further reflected this sense of refined quiet. Women of high status wore many layered robes known as junihito, each layer visible at the sleeve and hem. The colors chosen for these layers changed with the seasons, echoing the subtle shifts of nature: pale greens for early spring, deep blues during midsummer, muted reds in autumn, and soft whites in winter. The weight of the garments required slow, deliberate movements. A sudden gesture would disturb their elegant drape. Men wore robes dyed in subdued hues, often accompanied by tall, rounded hats that marked their rank within the court hierarchy. Clothing was not merely attire. It was a silent expression of harmony with the world's seasonal patterns. Daily life in the court revolved around ritual and poetry. Court members composed verses inspired by the changing sky, the appearance of blossoms, or the sound of rain falling on wooden roofs. These poems circulated through the palace, carried by attendants or written on narrow strips of paper tied to branches or screens. Poetry served not as entertainment, but as a means of maintaining emotional equilibrium, expressing sentiments in a form that soothed rather than stirred. A few lines could capture the tranquility of dew on grass, the fading of twilight, or the gentle rustle of fabric as someone passed through a hallway. Seasonal observances offered further structure to aristocratic life. Spring brought cherry blossoms, whose brief flowering became a metaphor for the fleeting nature of beauty. Summer nights hosted firefly viewings, where the pale glow of insects drifting above darkened gardens created a scene of quiet magic. Autumn arrived with the vivid color of maple leaves, while winter invited the contemplation of snow settling on pines and rooftops. These changes were not merely noted, they were honored through rituals, banquets, musical performances, and poetry contests. Each event reinforced the connection between natural cycles and courtly refinement. Religious life within the court blended elements of Shinto and Buddhism into a harmonious whole. Shinto rituals continued to honor the lineage of the imperial family, with ceremonies centered on purity, renewal, and offerings to the kami. These rituals took place in serene shrine spaces located within or near the palace grounds. Wooden torii gates framed the entrances, and stone pathways led to altars where offerings of rice, sake, and cloth were placed with quiet reverence. Priests wore garments of white and green, their movements measured as they performed rites that echoed ancient practices. Buddhism, introduced centuries earlier, brought a different form of calm. Monks chanted sutras in low, resonant voices that filled temple halls with steady vibrations. Incense drifted in slow spirals toward high ceilings, carrying with it a sense of transience and contemplation. Temples stood among groves of trees, their tiled roofs covered in soft layers of moss. Statues of bodhisattvas and arhats appeared in graceful poses, their expressions serene, their presence offering a sense of refuge and inner stillness. The court embraced both traditions simultaneously, weaving together the reverence of Shinto with the introspection of Buddhism. Amid this quiet splendor, power flowed in subtle ways. Authority was expressed not through open displays, but through lineage, knowledge of ritual, and mastery of etiquette. Noble families maintained influence through their connections to the imperial line, their understanding of court customs, and their ability to navigate the intricate world of poetry, ceremony, and seasonal obligations. Political maneuvering occurred, but it unfolded with the understated grace expected of the elite. Conversations delivered in soft tones, decisions masked in poetic references, alliances forged through marriages and shared ancestry. The inner chambers of the palace housed spaces reserved for women of the court, whose influence shaped literature, fashion, and cultural refinement. Here, attendants moved with quiet efficiency, preparing garments, arranging calligraphy tools, and maintaining the order of daily routines. Women spent hours crafting poems, writing elegant prose, or observing the world from behind latticed screens. Their writings, often reflective and richly descriptive, provided glimpses into the emotional and intellectual currents that moved beneath the surface of court life. Works such as The Tale of Genji and The Pillow Book captured scenes of the palace with remarkable subtlety. Moments of moonlight on water, the sound of distant footsteps, the hush of dawn. While the court presented a world of tranquility and refinement, it also existed in contrast to the quieter, earthbound routines of the surrounding countryside. Outside the capital, farmers tended rice fields, artisans shaped wood and clay, and fishermen cast nets into coastal waters. Their lives unfolded in close contact with the land, guided by the same natural cycles revered by the nobility but experienced in different forms. Yet even in these distant villages, the influence of the court was felt through festivals, religious observances, and the gradual spread of writing and artistic styles. The contrast between rural life and the world of the elite revealed the layered nature of Japanese society during this era. The court, with its emphasis on elegance, poetry, and ritual, represented a refined interpretation of the same natural rhythms that shaped village life. Where farmers saw the sun as a practical measure of time and weather, the nobility viewed it through a lens of symbolism and ceremony. Where villagers performed simple rites to honor the kami of their local shrines, the court enacted elaborate rituals that connected the imperial lineage to divine origins. Yet beneath these differences, a quiet unity persisted. Whether in the polished halls of the palace or the humble dwellings of rural communities, people moved through the same seasons, observed the same changes in the natural world, and inherited myths that spoke to the continuity of existence. The light associated with Amaterasu reached both the refined gardens of Heian and the rice paddies that stretched across distant provinces. The rhythm of life, though expressed differently across social classes, reflected a shared understanding of harmony, transience, and renewal. This interwoven structure of society, its contrasts softened by shared cultural threads, defined the world in which mythology evolved during the Haian era. The elite preserved ancient rituals through formal ceremonies, refined poetry into delicate expressions of seasonal beauty, and shaped the cultural landscape through their emphasis on calm, measured living. Their world stood as a counterpart to the more ancient, earthbound traditions uncovered by archaeology, offering a refined echo of beliefs that had guided communities for millennia. The world of the Haian aristocracy also depended heavily on the presence and work of attendants, craftsmen, and servants whose quiet contributions maintained the palace's serene atmosphere. These individuals moved through corridors with careful, practiced steps, their garments rustling softly against wooden floors. Their duties ranged from tending gardens to preparing ink for calligraphy, from arranging incense for ceremonies to maintaining the layered garments required for seasonal events. Though their roles did not carry the prestige of the nobility, their presence shaped the everyday rhythm of the court, creating an environment where rituals could unfold without disruption. Gardeners cultivated landscapes that mirrored idealized forms found in poetry and classical texts. They trimmed pine branches to emphasize graceful curves, arranged stones in patterns that suggested distant mountains, and tended ponds where koi moved slowly beneath the surface. Every gesture they made contributed to the tranquil unity between architecture and nature. Paths were cleared of fallen leaves, not through hurried motions, but with careful sweeps meant to preserve the quiet of the space. These gardens became extensions of the palace, reflecting the ideals of harmony and contemplation central to elite life. Musicians formed another integral part of the courtly world. Their instruments, koto, biwa, and flute, produced tones that drifted through hallways, enhancing the palace's gentle atmosphere. Performances accompanied rituals, celebrations, and poetry gatherings. The music, often slow and resonant, flowed like water, filling the palace with a sense of calm that deepened during twilight hours. Many melodies were inspired by nature, the call of birds echoing across valleys, the rustle of wind through bamboo, or the steady rhythm of rainfall on roof tiles. Through sound, the court merged the physical world with aesthetic expression, creating an environment where art and nature formed a single seamless experience. Calligraphers, too, shaped the refined world of the aristocracy. They practiced writing as both communication and art, crafting characters with strokes that balanced precision and elegance. The ink, ground slowly on stone with water, carried the faint scent of minerals. As brushes moved across delicate paper, they produced lines varying in thickness and shade, capturing the flow of thought in visual form. Letters were exchanged between courtiers as part of social life, each brushstroke revealing mood, intention, and understanding of aesthetic convention. In this way, written expression became another thread connecting individuals within the palace. Food preparation reflected the court's emphasis on subtlety and seasonality. Meals were arranged with attention to color, texture, and natural harmony. Steamed rice formed the foundation of many dishes, accompanied by delicately seasoned vegetables, clear broths, and fish prepared with light flavorings. Presentation mattered as much as taste. Serving vessels were chosen to complement the colors of the ingredients, creating scenes that resembled painted scrolls. Meals were eaten in silence or with soft conversation, allowing diners to appreciate the calm that surrounded them. Ceremonies played a central role in court life. Some rituals honored the imperial ancestors, performed in spaces adorned with sacred objects and lit by the warm glow of lanterns. Others marked seasonal transitions, the first day of spring, the arrival of summer rains, or the beginning of the Lunar New Year. These ceremonies unfolded with slow, deliberate movements. Priests recited ancient passages in measured tones. Attendants placed offerings with meticulous care. Incense drifted in gentle spirals toward high ceilings. Each ritual reinforced the sense of continuity linking the present to the distant past. Even the politics of the Haian court moved at a measured pace, guided by subtle gestures rather than overt commands. Influence was maintained through carefully cultivated relationships, quiet conversations held behind screens, and the exchange of poems or letters that hinted at intentions without stating them directly. Marriages between noble families strengthened alliances, forming networks of power that shaped governance. Yet even these political currents remained enveloped in the court's refined atmosphere, softened by etiquette, ceremony, and poetic expression. The imperial family, situated at the center of this world, embodied the connection between the human and divine realms. Their residence contained spaces dedicated to rituals inherited from ancient mythology. Seasonal ceremonies conducted by the emperor reaffirmed the spiritual lineage tracing back to Amaterasu. These rituals emphasized purity and renewal, involving the offering of freshly harvested rice, the recitation of ancient prayers, and the careful handling of sacred objects. The emperor's role was not defined by military command, but by spiritual stewardship, serving as a bridge between the visible world and the realm of the kami. Women of the imperial court occupied a sphere of refined creativity. Their writings documented the emotional nuances, visual impressions, and contemplative scenes that shaped daily life. Works such as The Tale of Genji presented the quiet inner landscapes of courtly existence, rooms divided by silk curtains, gardens illuminated by moonlight, and the shifting affections of individuals bound by the rhythms of etiquette. These works revealed not drama but subtle observation, emphasizing the fleeting nature of beauty and the delicate balance required to maintain social harmony. Yet the palace also knew moments of solitude. Large rooms, sparsely furnished, could feel expansive and hushed, their quiet broken only by the distant sound of a bell or the rustling of bamboo outside. Courtiers walked long corridors on soft tatami, their footsteps absorbed into the gentle stillness. Lantern light flickered against sliding screens during night hours, casting shadows that moved with the slightest draft. These spaces invited reflection on changing seasons, on the passage of time, and on the continuity of traditions maintained across generations. Travel beyond the palace offered another perspective on the elite's life. Aristocrats visited temples, shrines, or mountain retreats for periods of meditation or ritual observance. These journeys unfolded along pathways shaded by maples and cedars, with streams crossing the road in shallow trickles. Remote temples greeted visitors with deep silence, broken only by the chanting of monks or the sound of wind pressing against wooden beams. Such retreats reinforced the values of serenity and introspection central to Haian culture. The contrast between this refined world and the surrounding countryside remained gentle but clear. Outside the capital, farmers lived by rhythms dictated by rainfall, soil, and the demands of cultivation. Their homes lacked the ornamentation of the palace, yet they carried a simplicity shaped by necessity and connection to the land. Artisans working in villages produced pottery, cloth, or tools that found their way into both local markets and aristocratic households. Although separated by status, both worlds observed the same seasonal cycles and practiced rituals rooted in shared beliefs. In this layered society, the Haian elite served as custodians of tradition, shaping cultural expressions that would echo across centuries. Their emphasis on calm, beauty, and subtlety influenced poetry, literature, performance, and religious practice. Even after the political structure of the era changed, the aesthetic values cultivated within the court persisted, forming the foundation of many artistic traditions associated with Japan. Ultimately, the world of the Heian aristocracy represented a contrasting dimension of Japanese history, one shaped not by conflict or conquest, but by quiet refinement, deliberate expression, and the slow unfolding of life within spaces designed for contemplation. It stood as a carefully tended garden of cultural ideals, offering a serene counterpoint to the ancient earthbound rituals and the later warrior-dominated eras that would follow. As the refined world of the Haian court settled into its patterns of ceremony, poetry, and muted elegance, the broader landscape of Japan continued to exert its quiet influence on the imagination. Beyond palace walls and cultivated gardens, the mountains, forests, rivers, and coastlines remained unchanged in their slow, patient rhythms. These natural forms, older than any dynasty and untouched by the subtleties of aristocratic etiquette, shaped the deeper currents of belief that had guided Japan long before the rise of noble households. In the open spaces beyond the capital, the origins of myth could still be felt in the shape of distant ridges, in the voice of the wind crossing rice fields, and in the shadows cast by ancient trees. The natural world, expansive and unhurried, provided the foundation for the philosophical and spiritual frameworks that intertwined with mythology. And so, the narrative shifts once more, away from palace corridors and back toward the larger world that nurtured both myth and society, revealing how landscape, cosmology, and quiet philosophical traditions deepened the mythic imagination of Japan. The islands of Japan formed a landscape that seemed sculpted for contemplation. Mountain ranges ran like quiet spines across each region, their slopes rising gradually into peaks often softened by drifting clouds. Forests covered these mountains in dense layers: cedar, cypress, oak, maple, each species contributing its own scent, texture, and seasonality. In spring, the canopies took on fresh hues of green. In autumn, the leaves turned crimson, gold, and copper, creating wide expanses of shifting color. Snowfall in winter muted the sharpness of the terrain, covering branches and boulders in a delicate white that absorbed sound and created an atmosphere of deep quiet. Rivers descended from mountain springs, their waters moving with steady persistence through valleys and plains. Some streams coursed rapidly through narrow rocky passages, while others widened into calm currents that mirrored the sky. Their surfaces changed with the seasons, sometimes bright and clear, sometimes swollen and opaque after rains. Along their banks, willows let their slender branches trail in the water, and reeds swayed with the gentlest breeze. These rivers became symbols of continuity, reflecting the passage of time and the flow of life, inspiring stories of deities who inhabited their depths or watched over their crossings. Coastlines stretched along jagged shores shaped by volcanic activity. In some regions, waves struck against dark cliffs, sending up sprays of white foam that glimmered in sunlight. In others, beaches curved gently in arcs of pale sand, where tide patterns carved subtle grooves that shifted day by day. Offshore, small islands rose from the water like untouched remnants of an older world, their shapes softened by mist. This maritime environment nurtured myths involving sea spirits, dragons, and island-creating deities, preserving the sense of mystery associated with horizons that appeared and disappeared with weather. Volcanoes added a different form of presence, their peaks sometimes snow-covered, sometimes streaked with mineral colors, reminded communities of the unseen forces beneath the Earth's surface. Occasional tremors and eruptions shaped local lore, reinforcing the belief that powerful beings dwelled within the mountains. These geological events, though disruptive, unfolded in a rhythm that matched the long memory of the land, rare but enduring, shaping valleys, altering rivers, and leaving behind new soil upon which forests eventually grew again. This varied landscape created the conditions for a unique cosmology to flourish. Early communities understood their surroundings not as resources to control, but as a living environment imbued with presence. Mountains housed spirits, rivers carried voices, rocks held memory. Each place possessed a quiet individuality, a subtle character that could be sensed through recurring patterns of wind, water, and light. Over time, these impressions formed the foundation of beliefs about kami, beings not distant or abstract, but woven directly into the land's physical forms. Philosophy emerged alongside these impressions, shaped by encounters with nature rather than by written doctrine. Observing the cycles of growth and decay led to an acceptance of impermanence. Watching mist gather and dissipate across fields encouraged reflection on the transient. Noticing the return of blossoms each spring reaffirmed continuity. These experiences formed principles that later harmonized naturally with Buddhist teachings introduced from abroad. When Buddhism arrived, it carried with it ideas of impermanence, interdependence, and calm observation, concepts that resonated deeply with the rhythms of the Japanese landscape. Rather than replacing older beliefs, Buddhism settled into the spaces already prepared by centuries of observation. Mountain temples rose in remote regions where the quiet reinforced meditation. Monks traveled mountain paths lined with moss-covered stones, their footsteps softened by fallen leaves. Chanting carried through cedar forests, blending with wind and birdsong to create natural harmony. The fusion of Shinto and Buddhist thought created a worldview that treated the visible and invisible as two layers of the same landscape. Shrines and temples often stood near one another, sharing spiritual terrain. A grove of ancient trees could house both the kami of the land and the bodhisattvas invoked by Buddhist rituals. Pure water drawn from springs served both purification rites and monastic practices. This blending did not cause tension. Instead, it created a sense of cohesion in which different traditions supported a single view of existence shaped by tranquility, balance, and respect for unseen forces. Seasonal rituals reflected the philosophical rhythms of this blended worldview. Spring festivals honored renewal through dances performed beneath blooming cherry trees. Summer rituals acknowledged storms and the shifting energies of heat. Autumn brought gratitude for harvests, celebrated with quiet offerings placed at shrines. Winter invited inward reflection, marked by rituals involving fire, prayer, and purification. Each event reinforced the cyclical nature of life, connecting mythology to lived experience. The landscape's role in shaping myth extended beyond ritual. Many legends describe deities who created islands by stirring oceans with spears or who carved valleys through their movements. Others recounted mountain spirits who guided travelers or sea beings who protected fishermen. These stories did not contradict the philosophical understanding of impermanence. Instead, they offered narrative expressions of natural processes. Creation myths mirrored volcanic activity. Storm deities reflected seasonal winds. Stories of sun and moon expressed the observable patterns of light and darkness. Philosophical schools such as Shinto naturalism, Tendai Buddhism, and later Zen each interacted differently with the mythic tradition. Shinto naturalism emphasized harmony with nature, highlighting the presence of kami in stones, waterfalls, and groves. Tendai Buddhism, with its mountain temples and emphasis on contemplation, reinforced the view that enlightenment could arise from observing the natural world. Zen Buddhism, which flourished in later periods, refined this perspective into practices that embraced simplicity, silence, and direct experience. Zen gardens, though emerging later, embodied principles already present in ancient thought. Carefully raked gravel represented water. Stones placed in deliberate arrangements suggested islands or mountain ranges. Moss softened the lines between elements. These gardens distilled the landscape into symbolic form, allowing contemplation to unfold within a controlled environment. In this way, mythology, philosophy, and aesthetics merged into a single expression of calm. Art also absorbed these influences. Scroll paintings depicted mountains veiled in mist, rivers winding through forests, and small figures walking along narrow paths, scenes that reflected both physical landscapes and inner states of quiet reflection. Calligraphy emphasized fluid, balanced strokes that carried philosophical meaning in their form. Even musical compositions echoed natural rhythms through slow tempos and subtle tonal variations. As centuries passed, this intertwined worldview shaped the broader culture. Villages held local myths tied to their surroundings, stories of protective spirits, unusual stones, or forests said to harbor ancient presences. These tales coexisted peacefully with aristocratic literature and Buddhist teachings. People did not separate myth from philosophy or nature from the sacred. Instead, all aspects of life formed a single continuum, shaped by the movement of seasons, the shifts of weather, and the enduring presence of the land. This quiet cosmology gave Japanese myth its distinctive character. Rather than describing distant celestial realms or dramatic battles between gods, the mythology remained rooted in the earth, its mountains, waters, and forests. The sacredness of place became central. Every shrine reflected a landscape. Every ritual echoed a natural cycle. Every story grew from the land's textures, sounds, and moods. Through this perspective, mythology became less a set of fixed narratives and more an atmosphere, one that lingered across centuries, preserved in the shape of fields, the arrangement of stones, and the calm presence of trees that had stood since the earliest eras. The landscape also influenced architectural forms that emerged across centuries. Shrines took shape with raised floors, simple wooden beams, and thatched roofs. Structures designed not to dominate nature, but to coexist with it. Their entrances framed views of trees, mountains, or open sky. Pathways leading to these shrines often followed the natural curves of the land rather than imposing straight lines. Torii gates marked the transition from ordinary space to sacred ground, though the surrounding forest remained unchanged. This subtle boundary, supported by minimal construction, reflected a belief system that valued harmony over transformation. Temples, though often larger in scale, were built with similar respect for their environments. Some temples perched on mountain slopes where the sound of chanting drifted into valleys. Others stood beside lakes where reflections of their eaves merged with the surface of still water. Wooden beams, carved brackets, and tile roofs blended with the setting sun, casting long shadows across courtyards where monks walked in slow, deliberate steps. Bell towers stood tall, their bronze bells releasing deep tones that resonated across open air, marking time not with urgency but with steady reverence. Philosophical movements within Japan found expression in these spaces. Shinto emphasized purity and the cyclical renewal of life, expressed through rituals of washing, offering, and quiet observation. Buddhism offered contemplative practices that invited introspection and acceptance of impermanence. The combination created a worldview that honored both the external world of forests and rivers and the inner landscape of thought and emotion. People did not separate these realms sharply. Instead, they moved between them with ease, carrying lessons from nature into personal reflection and spiritual practice. Landscape painting, influenced by both Chinese traditions and Japanese aesthetics, became another way of engaging with myth and philosophy. Artists portrayed scenes where small human figures walked along pathways dwarfed by mountains rising into clouds. Waterfalls appeared as vertical streams of white ink, emphasizing both movement and stillness. Pine trees leaned over cliffs, their branches shaped by wind, offering quiet analogies to endurance and transformation. These paintings did not aim to reproduce the world exactly. They expressed the feeling of it, the atmosphere of a place where myth, nature, and human presence intertwined. Poetry continued to capture this atmosphere in concise, evocative lines. A few syllables could describe the arrival of autumn winds, the appearance of frost on grass, or the murmuring of a stream in early morning. Poets often incorporated mythic references in subtle ways, linking natural events to ancient stories of deities and spirits. A falling cherry blossom might evoke the ephemeral beauty associated with celestial maidens. A sudden rainstorm could recall legendary storm gods. The glow of the moon reflected in water might bring to mind tales of the lunar deity. These references did not disrupt the poem's calmness, but added depth that folded myth into the contemplation of nature. As Buddhism matured within Japan, new schools emerged that interacted uniquely with long-standing mythic sensibilities. The Pure Land tradition emphasized quiet recitation and reassurance, offering a gentle path toward spiritual release. Zen Buddhism, with its emphasis on direct perception, found congruence with landscapes where water, stone, and silence shaped experience. Monks practiced meditation in temples surrounded by trees centuries old, their roots gripping the earth with slow persistence. Their teachings often used natural metaphors, the clarity of water, the solidity of mountains, the movement of clouds across sky. The landscape itself became a teacher. The sound of rain on roof tiles reinforced the lesson of impermanence. The stillness of a lake at dawn mirrored the desired stillness of the mind. The changing colors of forests reflected the cycles of existence. These experiences deepened the philosophical layers of myth, transforming stories into meditative reflections. A deity of the mountain was not simply a figure in a tale, but an embodiment of everything the mountain represented: endurance, shelter, and immovable calm. Local myths thrived within this philosophical environment. Villages nestled at the foot of mountains maintained stories of spirits who protected travelers or guided hunters through dense forests. Regions prone to earthquakes preserved tales of giant creatures stirring beneath the earth. Coastal communities told stories of sea beings who carried storms or guided ships back to harbor. These myths grew from direct observation, shaped not by dramatic intentions, but by the slow integration of environmental events into narrative form. Shrines dedicated to such local deities often remained small, blending seamlessly into the landscape. Wooden structures stood beneath large trees whose roots broke through soil with ancient strength. Stone steps, worn smooth by countless feet, led upward through forest paths that softened all sound. Offerings placed at the altars were modest: rice, water, or simple bundles of grass. Yet they carried the weight of traditions repeated for centuries. The atmosphere around these shrines conveyed a sense of time stretching far beyond the memory of individuals, anchored in the land itself. In larger cultural centers, philosophical texts woven with mythic themes shaped artistic and intellectual thought. Scholars studied writings that blended cosmological ideas with observations of natural phenomena. They contemplated the relationship between human life and the forces that governed existence. They considered the significance of mountains as seats of divine presence, or the symbolism of water as both life-giving and purifying. These ideas influenced education, literature, and moral values, creating a worldview where nature was not merely a backdrop, but a guide. Even as political structures changed over centuries, rising and falling with shifting power, the deeper cosmology formed by land, myth, and philosophy remained. Warriors replaced nobles, castles replaced palaces, new governments shaped economic systems. Yet, the presence of ancient beliefs continued quietly. Shrines remained on mountainsides, temples continued their seasonal rituals, poems still captured changing seasons. Mythology, though ancient, remained alive in these expressions. By the time Japan entered later historical eras, the mythic imagination, shaped by landscapes and philosophical traditions, had become an inseparable part of cultural identity. It appeared in theater through slow, measured performances of no drama, where masked actors portrayed gods, spirits, and humans, moving across minimal stages with dreamlike slowness. It appeared in tea houses, where the tea ceremony emphasized harmony, respect, and tranquility in gestures practiced with exacting care. It appeared in gardens designed as microcosms of nature, encouraging contemplation through stone arrangements and quiet pathways. Thus, Segment 5 reveals how the landscape and philosophical currents of Japan shaped a mythology not built upon conflict or divine heroism, but upon observation, stillness, and harmony. Myths survived because they aligned with the environment, echoing mountains, reflecting rivers, and drifting like mist across valleys. They offered a quiet understanding of existence, one that resonated through centuries of artistic, spiritual, and cultural expression. Together, these elements formed a worldview where the sacred was not distant, but present in every leaf, stone, and shifting season, a quiet cosmology shaped by the gentle rhythms of the land. As the philosophical threads woven through the landscapes, temples, and ancient shrines settled into balance, the long narrative of Japanese mythology revealed itself not as a single story, but as an enduring atmosphere, an accumulation of impressions preserved across the ages. From the carved clay of early ritual figures to the refined poetry of the Haian court, from the shifting colors of mountain forests to the quiet chanting of monks in remote temples, each layer contributed to a tapestry shaped by observation, reverence, and continuity. This quiet lineage extended across centuries, untouched by the urgency of conflict and unhindered by dramatic upheaval. It lived in the slow rhythm of nature, in the patient rebuilding of shrines, and in the whispered retellings of legends shaped gently by time. As the narrative moves into its final reflection, It turns toward this long continuity, toward the subtle weave of myth and environment, belief and season, stillness and change, that has shaped the soul of Japan's ancient imagination. Japanese mythology, viewed through the broad arc of history, resembled the motion of a wide river whose course remained steady even as its waters changed with time. The earliest stories, born from observations of wind, water, and stone, flowed naturally into the rituals of ancient shrines. These rituals, shaped by the interplay between community and landscape, blended into the refined ceremonies of aristocratic courts. Through each period, the myths retained their quietness, their respect for natural rhythms, and their deep connection to the land. This continuity reflected the enduring stability of the environment itself. Mountains that watched over the first settlements continued to cast long shadows across later capitals. Forests that sheltered early rituals persisted as sacred groves, preserved for centuries as spaces of contemplation. Rivers that shaped agricultural cycles remained constant companions to villages and cities alike. These features anchored the myths, giving them structure even when the surrounding society transformed in ways unimagined by their earliest storytellers. The myths spoke not of distant celestial struggles, but of forces present in everyday life. The rising sun, steady and familiar, mirrored the radiance of Amaterasu. Storms sweeping across coastlines recalled tales of tempestuous deities tied to wind and sea. Mountains that loomed over villages carried the weight of ancient spirits. Rather than separating the natural from the divine, mythology held them in quiet unity, creating a world view where the sacred was woven into every moment of existence. This unity shaped not only belief, but the wider culture. It influenced poetry that lingered on the delicate appearance of blossoms or the shifting colors of autumn leaves. It guided architecture that worked with, rather than against, natural surroundings. It shaped rituals that marked the passage of seasons with gentle offerings and steady movements. Even the simplest practices, sweeping shrine paths, preparing sacred water, or lighting lanterns at dusk, reflected a philosophy that placed harmony at the center of life. Through war, political change, and shifting eras, this philosophy remained. Dynasties rose and fell, capitals moved, new traditions emerged. But behind these changes, the quiet presence of myth endured. It endured in the soft echo of bells ringing through mountain valleys, in the flicker of lantern light across temple floors, in the slow transformation of forests as seasons turned. Mythology became a lens through which the world was seen, a language through which natural events found meaning. As centuries passed, some stories grew more symbolic, losing their earlier literal shape, while others gained new interpretations. Yet the essence remained unchanged. The land continued to serve as the foundation for belief, its contours preserved in ritual, art, and memory. The stories endured because they reflected a truth felt by generations, that life unfolds in cycles, that beauty lies in transience, and that the world holds presence even in silence. This perspective created a mythology unlike many others, one rooted not in conquest or divine hierarchy, but in coexistence. The gods were not remote sovereigns, they were embodiments of forces experienced daily. The divine was not distant, it was inherent in every stream, grove, and mountain. This closeness softened the boundaries between human life and the unseen, allowing myth to remain a constant companion through changing times. Even in the present age, The influence of these myths continues quietly. Shrines stand beneath ancient trees whose branches move with the same wind that once shaped early rituals. Pilgrims follow mountain trails worn by centuries of footsteps, their paths guided by markers whose meanings linger even if their origins are forgotten. Festivals continue to celebrate seasonal transitions, echoing ancient ceremonies that welcomed spring or honored the harvest. And in art, literature, and everyday gestures, the spirit of the old stories persists, gentle, atmospheric, and enduring. The mythology of Japan, when viewed in its entirety, becomes less a collection of tales and more a landscape of shared memory. It holds within it the quietness of dawn spreading across rice fields, the tranquility of pine forests touched by snow, the steady movement of waves against rocks. It is the memory of fires glowing in early dwellings, of clay figures shaped with reverence, of poems written beneath lantern light. It is the gentle weight of centuries layered one upon another, forming an unbroken thread of belief and presence. In this way, the myths remain alive, not through loud retellings or elaborate rituals, but through the soft recognition of patterns that persist across time. They reside in the stillness that descends at dusk, in the gentle return of sunlight after rain, in the hush of early morning when mist lingers over fields. They speak through the environment itself, reminding each generation of the continuity that links past and present. Myth becomes a way of seeing, a way of sensing the subtle movements of the world, of understanding the relationship between human life and the forces that sustain it. It invites contemplation rather than excitement, reflection rather than urgency. It endures because it mirrors the rhythms of nature, slow, steady, cyclical. And so the narrative draws toward its conclusion, settling back into the calm atmosphere that has guided it from the beginning. The landscapes that shaped the earliest stories remain, unchanged in their quiet presence. The rituals that carried myth across centuries persist in festivals and shrines. The philosophies that deepen these beliefs continue to inform the culture's sense of harmony and impermanence. What began as whispers among early communities became refined into stories carried across generations. What emerged from clay, stone, and water grew into a vast mythological tapestry still visible in the contours of daily life. And as the centuries passed, the myths of Japan settled gently into memory, enduring not through grandeur, but through the calm persistence of the natural world that inspired them. The mythology of Japan, when viewed through the full sweep of centuries, revealed itself as a structure built not from stone or monument, but from atmosphere, an accumulation of impressions shaped by countless seasons. Its endurance depended upon this subtlety. It lived in the drifting of cherry blossoms along quiet streams, in the pale glow of lanterns beneath summer rain, in the faint murmur of wind moving through bamboo at twilight. No single moment defined it. Rather, it was formed through the patient layering of memory, observation, and ritual repeated with gentle persistence. Throughout the long arc of history, these impressions gathered in the minds of those who watched the world with steady attention. Farmers who tended rice fields at dawn carried myths in the cadence of their work. Monks who walked mountain paths at dusk preserved stories through soft chants that echoed through the trees. Poets who studied the shifting clouds above distant ridges wove threads of myth into their verses. Artisans who carved wood or shaped clay held the old stories in the curves of their creations. Myth did not require preservation through force. It endured quietly, sustained by the land itself and by the minds of those who perceived its presence. In forests where cedar and cypress grew in tall, straight columns, the air held a gentle coolness. Light filtered through layers of branches, falling in patterns that shifted as breezes passed overhead. Many believed such forests to be inhabited by beings older than memory, their presence felt in the unusual stillness that settled beneath the canopy. This sense of presence shaped the early imagination, and even in later eras, the atmosphere of these groves remained unchanged. Priests walked beneath the trees carrying offerings wrapped in white cloth, their footsteps muffled by moss-covered ground. These rituals, practiced with calm consistency, kept myth alive without altering its quiet nature. The mountains offered a different kind of presence. Their slopes, sometimes steep and rugged, sometimes soft with grass and low shrubs, reached into skies that changed throughout the day. Morning mists drifted across their ridges. Afternoon sunlight revealed the texture of their rocks, and evening shadows deepened their contours. In winter, snow softened their lines, creating a stillness that resonated through surrounding valleys. Each mountain held its own character, and communities living nearby often developed stories about the spirits believed to dwell within them. Even as the centuries passed and trails were carved into their sides, the mountains retained their sense of timelessness. They served as reminders of permanence within a world defined by impermanence. Rivers, with their constant movement, added another dimension to this continuity. Flowing with rhythms unaffected by human affairs, they carried water from highlands to coastlines, nourishing fields and reflecting shifting skies. People observed the changes in their currents, the colors of their surfaces, and the patterns carved into their banks. Myths arose from these observations. Stories of protectors, guardians, and unseen watchers associated with the water's steady motion. These stories moved from region to region, changing slightly with each retelling, yet always retaining their foundation in the natural world. The rivers remained unchanged in their purpose, and the stories attached to them endured alongside their flowing waters. The ocean, vast and impossible to fully grasp, offered yet another layer of mythic meaning. Its tides rose and fell with a regularity that felt ancient. Waves struck shorelines with consistent rhythm, varying only with storms or seasonal shifts. Fishing communities, attuned to the ocean's moods, developed stories that reflected both respect and caution. They spoke of beings who shaped storms, who guided ships, or who dwelled in deep waters beyond sight. These tales reminded generations of the ocean's power and its role in sustaining life. Even in later eras, when ships traveled across distant seas, the myths persisted, carried by sailors who watched horizons widen and narrow with each journey. Together, these landscapes created the backdrop for a philosophy that emphasized harmony, quiet acceptance, and awareness of cycles. Myths, therefore, became expressions of the same principles reflected in nature. They spoke of creation not as an abrupt act, but as a gradual forming of land from water, of islands rising through persistent shaping, of light returning after withdrawal. They spoke of forces acting not in sudden bursts, but in long, measured arcs. The stories remained calm because the world that inspired them moved with steadiness rather than volatility. When later eras introduced dramatic historical shifts, The myths endured because they remained anchored in the landscape rather than in political systems. Governments could change, capitals could move, and customs could evolve, but mountains remained in their places, forests continued to grow, and rivers followed their paths. The continuity of nature preserved the continuity of myth. Even as new philosophies arrived, they intertwined seamlessly with older beliefs, creating a broad, layered worldview in which every tradition found its place. This layered continuity created a mythology that felt less like a set of rules and more like an atmosphere, an inherited sense of presence that shaped how people understood time, change, and the world around them. It became a quiet guide, encouraging a calm recognition of cycles, a respect for impermanence, and an appreciation for the subtle rather than the dramatic. It invited reflection rather than reaction, observation rather than intervention. In the modern age, the myths still linger in these quiet forms. Shrines remain at the bases of mountains and along forest edges. Temples continue their chants as seasons turn. Artists, writers, and travelers still find inspiration in landscapes shaped by volcanic creation and centuries of wind. The myths no longer serve as literal explanations, yet they endure as expressions of atmosphere, memory, and reverence. They exist in moments of stillness, in slow-moving clouds, in the sound of rain falling on old wooden roofs. They remain present, not as narratives of power, but as gentle reminders of the world's deeper rhythms. The final centuries of the mythic tradition unfold not in grand tales, but in the slow recognition that the stories have become part of the land itself. They reside in the hush of ancient forests, in the breath of wind across open fields, in the echo of bells ringing through mountain valleys. They inhabit the quiet moments at dusk when shadows lengthen and the first stars appear in the sky. They reflect the patience of nature, the endurance of memory, and the calm that settles over the land as night begins to fall. Myth becomes a quiet companion to time, following it gently through centuries of change. It lingers in the spaces between day and night, in the transitions between seasons, in the subtle shifts that shape each moment. This quiet companionship allows the stories to endure, not through force, but through the soft presence they maintain within the world. And so, as this long reflection draws toward its close, the myths of Japan drift once more into the calm atmosphere from which they emerged. They return to the mountains that shaped their earliest forms, to the forests that sheltered ancient rituals, to the rivers that carried them across generations. They settle once again into the quiet rhythms of nature, awaiting the next moment when memory or imagination brings them gently to life. And with this, the long journey through the ancient myths of Japan settles into its final stillness. The stories, shaped by mountains older than memory and forests that have witnessed centuries, return peacefully to the places from which they once emerged. Their presence lingers softly in the quiet spaces between thoughts, like distant echoes carried on evening wind, or faint ripples spreading across a calm lake at dusk. The world of myth grows quiet now. Lantern light dims. Night settles gently over the landscape, and the old stories, softened by time, drift slowly back into silence. May the calm of these legends accompany the hours that follow. May the steady rhythms of ancient seasons bring rest. And may the quiet spirit of these tales carry the mind gently toward sleep. With this, the myths of Japanese legends come to a peaceful end, wishing a deep, tranquil, and restful good night.